Well, let's get started this morning with a new section in History of the Churches. This is actually our second to last section. We're getting very close to the end. Although I'm actually thinking about adding some things on. A lot of what we have here is leading up to the time of the Anabaptists and the early days then as we shift to the United States in a little bit. There'll be some shifting, but a lot of it is Europe and England, mainland Europe and then England. So we're not going to necessarily be covering kind of getting up to current on churches in the United States. And I think that is actually a really beneficial subject because there's a lot of aspects in the United States that is different than in other places. And for us here in the United States, it's helpful to get a grasp on that, even some elements of Baptist history throughout the United States. So we're not going to go into all the different types of churches, denominations, but especially getting up to speed on some of the history of Baptist churches in the United States. I will also say tried to look up some Baptist history for Eastern Europe, and it's harder to find those types of resources. So a lot of this, and of course, and Victor is coming from. He's come from the Eastern Europe side of things when it comes to the church history. And for our book, and I explained this to him, I mentioned it, I said, this book is leading more to what we have a frame. The book is centered more on our frame of reference from the West, which is why, and it might just be harder to find the church history.
If I may, I think the major spread of Baptists in Eastern Europe went to the World War I.
Okay. And that was another thought I had, that maybe the history starts later than this. Okay.
Prisoners of war from World War I. They were captured by Germans, then they were released. Actually, they were converted there, and they were released, and they came to Eastern Europe and did some.
Okay.
Aside from the missionaries, but
right.
Was one of the major. I know in the area that I grew up, that one was the major where the Baptists actually came into the region was after World War I.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And then you also have then the rise of communism in the Soviet Union, which also probably affected the spread of Christianity there in that region. And so definitely a different important, and certainly just as important, just because we're looking from an American frame of reference here, being in America. Church history on that side of the world is just as important as well. So it's not a purposeful neglecting of that. It's more of what we more identify with here in the United States is what comes more from the Western influence. For example, our holidays are based more, or the religious holidays are based on the Catholic calendar, and the Orthodox, which would have been the established religion where in Eastern Europe and Russia, and then there's Oriental Orthodox in Africa, and they have a different calendar. They have a different days of celebration and observance of those things. So this is why this is where our frame of reference is, because of our calendar, because of the holidays we have, and the way the history progressed in that side. So what we're going to look at is now are the Anabaptists of the Reformation era, and so about 1500 to 1700, and some introductory observations we have are everything's not working today. Okay, I think this happened one other time. We do this. We get out of that. All right, somebody, we're going to have to pray for the Lord's intervention on our technology here in church. All right, this is, oh my goodness.
Frisbee.
Well, sometimes that would be helpful.
Biting my tongue the whole time.
Yeah. Russ sits there all smug and, see, I'm vindicated on my stance on technology. But it works. Okay. Introductory observations. The first is that the name Anabaptist, by the way, this computer, I shouldn't even be using this laptop anymore. There's a reason this is over here. This was my wife's laptop. She has a different laptop, which that one turned out to be kind of a lemon too, but is it running any faster? I don't know. She had a problem. We had to send it out and get repaired. But anyway, this one is done, but I do manage it for Sunday morning. But the name Anabaptist was a slander, and Anabaptist means rebaptizer, and so they were called that as a slander, and they didn't accept the infant baptism of the Catholics and Protestants as valid, so they didn't really view themselves as rebaptizers. They viewed people needing scriptural biblical baptizing. And when they did that, that was their first, if you want to say, scriptural baptism, even though as far as getting a little bit wet, they would be rebaptizing. But the term Anabaptist and Baptist was not necessarily given initially to by themselves, calling themselves Baptists or Anabaptists. It was, those Baptists or those Anabaptists. And by the way, even today some people still have the attitude, those Baptists for different reasons. But it was meant to be a slander. And which now Baptists willingly call themselves Baptists, saying, yeah, this is what we stand for. This is what we identify as. But back in the beginning, that was not the case. And that's part of the reason why some would say, well, Baptists got started in the 1600s because they look at a fixed start date of when were these people, churches, and particularly in the U.S. and particularly first in England and coming over to the U.S., that they were calling themselves Baptists, and they got to be known more as Baptists more widely. But before that, they were being called Baptists and Anabaptists. It's just a lot of these groups were also known by different names based on their leader or geographical region. The Baptists spread very quickly in the 16th century. And as I just really mentioned, the Baptists did not suddenly appear in the 16th century or 17th century, you could say. They didn't just appear all of a sudden. Boom! All right, the Baptists got started in the 1500s or 1600s. No, the principles, those principles were being practiced. Those doctrines were being practiced by various groups, and of course there was a lot of variation between the groups throughout those hundreds and hundreds of years, which we've already covered that. But they didn't just suddenly appear. There have always been Anabaptists from the time that infant baptism and apostasy took over churches in the early centuries. Lutheran historian Mashim wrote in Institutes of Ecclesiastical History, he said now notice this is a Lutheran historian, so this wouldn't be a biased Baptist historian. Prior to the age of Luther, there lay concealed in almost every country of Europe, but especially in Bohemia, Moravia, Switzerland, and Germany, very many persons in whose minds were deeply rooted that principles which the Waldenses, Wycliffites, and Hussites maintained, some more covertly and others more openly, namely that the kingdom which Christ set up on the earth, or the visible church, is an assembly of holy persons, and ought therefore to be entirely free from not only ungodly persons and sinners, but from all institutions of human device against ungodliness. This principle lay at the foundation, which was the source of all that was new and singular in the religion of the Mennonites, and the greatest part of their singular opinions, as is well attested, were approved some centuries before Luther's time by those who had such views of the Church of Christ. So that's a Lutheran historian saying these people, these groups were around before. Not only is he referring to baptism, he also referred to their belief about the church, what the church is, that it's a visible assembly of persons, and that's very significant as well. Zwingli said, and he was not friendly to the Baptists, the institution of Anabaptism is no novelty, but for 300 years had caused the greatest disturbance in the church. Now he's talking about Protestant, when he says the church, the established churches, and has acquired such strength that the attempt in this age to contend with it appears futile for a time. In the early 1800s, the King of the Netherlands appointed a commission to examine the history of the Dutch Baptists. 2 prominent members were part of the Dutch Reformed Church. So once again, these are not people who are would have a good reason to be biased toward the Baptist history or position. But the report said, "We have now seen that the Baptists, who were formerly called Anabaptists and in later times Mennonites, were the original Waldenses and who have long in the history of the church received the honor of that origin. On this account, the Baptists may be considered as the only Christian society which has stood since the days of the apostles, and as a Christian society which has preserved pure the doctrines of the gospel throughout all ages." And so that was in the early 1800s that they were saying that, recognized that. So the teaching today, and I realize today in our vast, numerous types of churches, it seems very exclusive to say, oh yes, we believe the Baptists were the ones who've held to the sound doctrine and the gospel, going back to the apostles, because there are multiple churches who believe that. And so we'd say, well, you're just saying the same things the Catholics do, or the Orthodox do, or the Church of Christ does, but here in the early 1800s, so that is not a new thing, just in modern day times where that claim would be made. At the same time, it is vain to debate potential links between the various Baptist groups, and this is where there are some various viewpoints among Baptists today. There are those who are really so much for the Baptist lineage and heritage back to the apostles, where they say that they believe it's possible to trace trace your church back through this church, that church, then you go all the way back to the apostles. Some think that that's possible. And they say if you're not part of that line, then you're not really a true church. And so there are some who go very much, and that would be what would be considered probably more likely, I think it's called landmarkism, and then along with that usually comes the Baptist bride doctrine as well, believing that it's the Baptist churches alone that are the bride of Christ, as opposed to, all the believers will be part of that. But that is, so there are varieties of that. And then on the other hand, you have Baptists who don't even know why they're Baptist and might as well not even be called Baptist anymore. So I mean, you run the whole spectrum. But it is vain to debate the potential links because of history, and even this history which we've covered here. It's hard to see. There were different groups at different times, but the main point I want to get across is there were always people who were separate from the established churches, the state churches that go back to the apostles. There were always people who were separate from that. And I think there's a good case to be made that the state church, now it would even be before the East-West split, was probably started as a biblical church with sound doctrine and then eventually apostatized. And then eventually, but then from there would be people who were separated and splintering out from that, saying, look, this, and that's been the history, that is church history. Church history is this cycle of sound doctrine, apostasy, separation. Sound doctrine, apostasy, separation is a long history of that. And that's why it's simply the main point is there have always been people since those times in the apostles who have held to the biblical belief on baptism, other Bible doctrines, that it wasn't that somehow once the Rome and Constantinople, the established churches there, the state churches, once they got established, that there was just nobody else. And then all of a sudden we had to wait 1,500 years or 1,400 years, and then finally there was the Reformation, and then finally these things. No, it wasn't that everything just disappeared for 1,500 years or 1,400 years. It was, we've already covered, there have always been those groups that were separated. And they're not always going to be alike, not always alike in everything, but there have always been those that were separate. So we don't, and some of those that you would say the Waldenses and various names that we've covered, not all of them were linked. Some of them might have had some things in common. Some of them might have had some relation to each other. And then there were others, there were some of these groups that were just operating in different places, maybe at overlapping times. But we don't necessarily need to have that debate. It's just the point that there have always been those who separated. There were many different kinds of Baptists. The term Anabaptist was a broad one that encompassed many types of belief and practice. Some were communal and others were not. In other words, like practiced communism among themselves. And some were pacifists and others were not. So they would say, we don't believe in going to war. And then some would say, we don't believe in going to war, but we do believe in defending yourself. And then there were some who went so far as to say even the government should not bear the sword. So various beliefs on that. The Baptists were fond of singing, and Baptists are still fond of singing. And some used instruments, and others did not. Their songs and hymns were strong and doctrinal. And there is a hymn, and I don't know if this is necessarily all written by Baptists, but I think it's put out by Baptists. There's a hymnal I want to get my hands on that I think it has about 1,000 hymns in it. And because the hymnals we use, a lot of the songs, number one, have been written only in the last 100, 150 years. And there's a lot of other older songs that go back farther. And not all of them were written by Baptists. There were a few Baptists that wrote some hymns. But either way, the Baptists loved to sing. And that heritage still remains to this day. It's important, though, that the songs and hymns are still strong and doctrinal. That is important. Many Waldenses adopted Protestant doctrine during the Reformation, and so the Waldenses of the past are not the same as the Waldenses that then came more into modern times. And once again, that goes back to the point that churches do not remain the same from generation to generation, and when there is change, it's usually toward compromise and apostasy. That's why there has to always be the deliberate choice to stand firm and hold the ground, because the natural way to go, if you let things slip, is to go toward compromise and apostasy. That's just the way it goes. And all you got to do is just look at history. I mean, look at church, not just far ancient history, but look at modern day history in the last couple hundred years. It's not hard to see that at all. I'll give you one example. And we might cover a little bit of this. We'll see how this goes when we get to the end, how much I want to cover of more in the last couple hundred years, but when we get to the end of this whole series. But the Southern Baptist Convention just elected a new president. Now, their outgoing president, he preached. He gave a message on about a year and a half ago, close to it, Romans chapter 1. He was going through Romans, and he got to Romans chapter 1. And he's one, he would say, and this is very characteristic of a lot of modern-day Baptists, whether they're Southern Baptists or even maybe other kinds of Baptists, but let's hold to, here's my personal belief, but here's what I'm teaching, and here's my practice of it. So it's almost apologizing for their belief, trying to get around it somehow. And so he would certainly believe that homosexuality, a lifestyle, is wrong. But when they get to Romans 1, well, what do you do with Romans 1? Well, the way they explain Romans 1 is, well, one of the ways is, look at all these other sins here that are listed. Yeah. That they kind of shift the focus, that it's not all about, which it's not all about homosexuality, but there's a key portion in there that is very important, that's it's singled out. It's not just in a list, it's singled out. And he quotes I think it was a woman in their church who leads, I think, a ladies' ministry or something. And so he said, we ought to whisper where the Bible whispers, and shout where the Bible shouts about. And their position is the Bible whispers about homosexuality. That was what he said. Now the new president, interestingly enough, just a couple months ago, or at some point recently, he is also going through the book of Romans in his church. And someone put together a video of how either they're getting their sermons from the same online source, like paying for their sermon outline and illustrations, or he plagiarized the outgoing president's sermon because somebody put together clips of the sermon, and you can tell it's too close to be coincidental. And he's repeating almost the same things. It's not always word for word, but pretty much some of the key points of that portion. And he said the same thing. We ought to whisper, where the Bible whispers, and we need to shout where the Bible shouts. And this is the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention. So it's going to be kind of a continued term for maybe just a different personality a bit. But that's what the change usually consists of. Now, if you were to ask them, and actually to his credit, I'm going to say something. Robert Jeffress is also a Southern Baptist. He's got a large church in Dallas, and there are some problems I have with Robert Jeffress. In as far as being too politically minded, and he was very much. You could almost put him down as a Trump worshiper almost. I mean, he's extreme into politics, but at the same time, he was interviewed on a radio program, I think, by another Christian, another Southern Baptist. I think Todd Starnes is a Southern Baptist, and so I heard the little clip of him, and he came out and very strongly disagreed with that, saying, no, the Bible shouts about homosexuality. So to give him credit for that, he would be on the right side of that argument of saying, no, that is not. And but anyway, that's what the change usually consists of, going toward compromise and apostasy, and so this is where they do the end around. They say they kind of push off one issue to the side, and they say, well, Christ was harder on the Pharisees than he was on the sinners, and that's what they say. That's what they're saying. Yes.
Yes. In general, you're right, but I was just thinking when you said that usually leads to more away from the Bible. However, if you look from the Catholic standpoint, then Anabaptists are going away from the Bible, from the teaching of the
Right,
Church.
right.
So there's not as always something that breaks away or something that's a new beginning is necessary bad, or a new turn into the church's history is necessary bad, because that's why the Baptists came along. That's why other, really God-centered churches became. And I think I'm sorry, I'm taking over. So.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. No, and what I should clarify is when I make that statement is when we say the change is usually toward compromise and apostasy, we're talking about those who have already come out. They've already changed for the better from, say, the Catholic Church or of these others that were teaching false doctrine. They come out and they have the right things for a while. And so that's really what perspective when I make that statement, because you're right that from their perspective, they're apostatizing, they're heretics. And I think way back at the beginning last year when we started this, we did mention that there are different ways the term heretic can be used. And at times Catholics called people heretics when they weren't really heretics. And then there is true heresy when you're departing from the teachings of the Bible. So, just to clarify, when we say the change is usually toward compromise and apostasy, we're speaking from the perspective of those who have the right doctrines, the right teachings, and when they change, they're usually not changing for the better. And then somebody separates and they say, no, we need to go differently, and then they take the right track. So, and that's been the pattern. That's been the cycle throughout history. Baptists often progressed in their doctrine. In other words, many of them came through the Catholic and Protestant doctrines first. They were influenced by Catholics. Some of them were brought up Catholic and trained Catholic or Protestant. And so what will happen is maybe some Catholics or Protestant, they'll use their older writings to say, well, they believe this, but maybe they hadn't progressed to where they got later in their beliefs. And just because they believed something at first doesn't mean they kept those beliefs, such as sprinkling or pouring. So there might have been someone who's heading toward the Baptist doctrine, so they wrote some things that they were already starting to separate, and they still believed in sprinkling, but then later on they realized that was wrong, and they didn't do that anymore. The term Anabaptist was applied to some strange groups, so that had nothing to do with what we're talking about here. So they just put that label on different groups as a slander, not just ones who believed in biblical baptism, but also just ones that were, there was one group that was more cultish-like, there was one that was more of like a political type of rebellion, and just various ones they'd label people as they saw fit. The Baptists were persecuted by both Catholics and Protestants. The Baptists of the Reformation era were simple and scriptural in their church order. John Christian quotes Cornelius from, and I need, I think, a German-speaking person for this one, but Geschichte des Münsterischen. I shouldn't even butcher that. That's an insult to the German language.
Geschichte is a story.
What's that?
Geschichte.
Geschichte, yeah, Geschichte, D-E-S. Das, and M-U-N-S-T-E-R-I-S-C-H-E-N. So it's Munsterischen, and then A-U-F-R-U-H-R-S. Aufrurs. So we'll stick to that. But anyway, quoting from this work, the administration of the affairs of the congregation was exceedingly simple. Through baptism, one entered into the fellowship of the believers. Each congregation had its own leader called teacher or pastor who was elected by the congregation. If death or persecution removed him, a new man was elected to take his place. Besides these, there were persons selected to take care of the poor and competent persons. Besides these, there were persons selected to take care of the poor, and competent persons were sent out as missionaries. The duties of the pastor were to warn, to teach, to pray in meetings, to institute the breaking of bread, and to represent the church in withdrawing the hand of fellowship. On Sunday, the congregation came together to read the Word of God, to exhort one another, and to build one another up in Christian doctrine. From time to time, the Lord's Supper, which they termed the breaking of bread, was celebrated. The two most important doctrines during the Reformation era were a pure church and liberty of conscience. And of course, the baptism issue was always an ongoing issue for them. But there were other ones during that Reformation era that were also very, very important, that they wanted a pure church, and at the same time also they opposed a state church and opposed persecuting those who believed differently. And very, very important issues there, because even the Protestants during that Reformation era, not all the Protestants, many of the Protestants, especially the leadership, did not believe in liberty of conscience. And that's one of the hallmark core principles of the founding of America. When America was first founded, not everybody practiced liberty of conscience. This was pre-Declaration of Independence, pre-Constitution. Liberty of conscience was not always practiced or respected or believed, depending on the place. But what got enshrined in our founding documents was the issue of liberty of conscience, that people have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and also that there would be no laws that would prohibit the free exercise of religion or establish a religion. That's on the federal level, but that's also in many state constitutions as well. And Massachusetts has some very strong wording in the state constitution about religious liberty. And that is a very uniquely Baptist doctrine, is the liberty of conscience, because as we've looked in this history of the churches, that was not something that came from the Protestants. Now, many here in America now, who even Protestant churches, they would believe that. Many in America, it's kind of like, well, if you have to do it and then you kind of get used to it, you realize that is a good idea. That is a good thing. So I'm not saying today that Protestants do not believe in liberty of conscience. In America particularly, there might be, even maybe in Europe, there's still some of that lingering, there's still more of the lingering effects of the state churches, but and still state churches. But in America, one of the things that's widely recognized and appreciated is the liberty of conscience, although we're seeing the loss of liberty of conscience take a different appearance. So it's not so much in the churches, it's now in the mainstream of society that you can't say certain things or you're going to be silenced. You can't say certain things, you're going to be banned. You can't say certain things, you're going to be fired. You can't say certain things. And while we recognize that that's what happens when you get too much of a politicized society. If we didn't have such a politicized society, those things wouldn't be as much of an issue. But such a divisive society of where you say things and it's so much is controversial now. You can't say anything without it being. Now, out of respect, if I'm working at a secular workplace, and I'm gonna respect the fact that I'm at a secular workplace, and I don't want to put my employer in that company in a position where where they get the flack for something I say that has nothing to do with my job. But at the same time, the liberty of conscience is where there's a lot of people who don't respect that, where if they find out you say something offensive on social media, they'll find out where you work and they'll report you and they will make a big deal about something you said on social media. And that's, by the way, those people just need a life. If all they have to do is sit around on social media and police what everybody says, I mean, they need a life anyway. But they treat Twitter as about as important as the Bible. Oh, you said this, we're going to make a big deal about it. But pure church, liberty of conscience, very, very important doctrines during the Reformation era. And I think we're going to have to stop there for sake of time, and we'll continue next week in getting into some specific things about Baptists in certain parts of Europe, and we'll get into England and then eventually move into the more, I'd say modern, but like 1700 on type of missionary movements as well. But we'll stop here for now.